Well, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Brian Perry, this year's speaker for the Dyer Labrador Memorial Lectureship. Dr. Perry comes to us from Nairobi, Kenya, where he is a veterinary epidemiologist for the International Livestock Research Institute. He is a graduate of Edinburgh University, and he spent a few years in veterinary practice before his interest in tropical veterinary medicine beckoned him to enter the field of tropical veterinary medicine and epidemiology. He has served stints in a variety of countries, including Ethiopia, Guatemala, Peru, Colombia, Uruguay, and Zambia. He also spent a number of years at Virginia Tech College of Veterinary Medicine, where he established their epidemiology program. Dr. Perry is a past chairman of the International Society for Veterinary Epidemiology and Economics Society. And he has been a long-time advocate of combining disciplines to investigate livestock diseases. Today we're delighted to have Dr. Perry with us to discuss the poverty reduction in the developing world. What role can animal health research play? Dr. Perry.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Osborne, and what a tremendous pleasure it is, an honor to be here in Davis, California, and speaking to such an auspicious audience. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me. My talk is on poverty reduction in the developing world. What role can animal health research play, as Dr. Osborne said? And as he also said, I work for ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, which is one of the 16 centers around the world under the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, now known in a rather easier form as the Future Harvest Centers, which is research into agriculture for the developing world. And ILRI is the livestock one of those. And increasingly our attentions are focused on poverty reduction, because poverty is central to development in the developing world. And poverty, if you look at some of the figures, they're really rather stark. The world has approximately 6 billion people, 2.8 billion of those, so virtually half, on less than $2 a day, 1.2 billion on less than $1 a day. And of course, as time goes on, by the year 2025, which is not that long ago, another 2 billion people, estimated that 97% of these will be in developing countries. So it's the dynamics that are really frightening. A lot of thought has been put into poverty reduction, more and more as time goes on, and clearly the World Bank, IFAD there, and our own institute, among many others, to try and work out what are the different approaches that should be taken to reducing poverty. And many donors and many others adopted some years ago these rather ambitious international development targets, which include these three of reducing the proportion of people living in extreme poverty by 50% to the year 2015, universal primary education in all countries by 2015, and a reduction in the mortality rates for infants and children under the age of 5 by 66%, and maternal mortality reduction by 75%. Tremendously ambitious targets, and one is very concerned that these, whether these will be met or not. So where on earth do livestock fit into this rather broad and quite frightening picture? Well, livestock form a very important component of the livelihoods of almost 3/4 of the world's poor, 70%. They support the livelihoods of poor farmers, but of course also the consumers of livestock products, people that trade in livestock products, and of course wage laborers that work in the livestock industries or associated industries. Disease is very much an everyday occurrence. Every day the poor wake up with their livestock, there are disease issues, and of course the animals of the poor are even more vulnerable than many of the others. Poor farmers have very few animals, so loss is extremely important. And livestock form this reserve in lean times, but those lean times, when nutrition levels are low, are clearly when the effects of disease can be even more severe. Now, taking a slightly different approach, looking at the developing, the pace of development in the world, the consumption of livestock products is changing fast, is predicted to change fast. And a really important document that came out a couple of years ago called Livestock to 2020, The Next Food Revolution, written by Chris Delgado from IFPRI, a sister institute of ours, the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., and colleagues from FAO and ILRI, drew some interesting conclusions from some modeling work that they were doing. And this is the first component. When you're looking at the consumption of meat compared to the log per capita gross national product, and plotting different countries and the progress. And you will see that there is this trend for as countries become more affluent, there is this trend for an increased meat consumption. Now, this, as I will say in a minute, is quite different from the consumptions in the north. As people become more affluent, meat is a desirable product. And so, taking these and looking at what is going to happen to the consumption in different countries of beef, pork, poultry, meat and milk, comparing 1993 to 2002, they see the consumption increasing dramatically. And if you translate that into the total meat consumption in different regions, you will see these dramatic predicted increases. Now, in meat and in milk, China, of course, being one of the huge growth areas, but also looking at things like milk in sub-Saharan Africa, going from possibly 14 million metric tons to 31. So really important predicted demand. But I do emphasize this is predicted demand. So really, in one of the avenues that I'll be talking a little bit about in a minute, to getting the poor out of poverty is seeing whether they are able to pick up these predicted future market opportunities. Is it possible to do that? But the world is an unkind place, and there are many threats and pressures on them that are likely to restrict that, and we have to be thinking of how we can encourage it rather than restrict it. First of all, the population growth and urbanization, so the competition in developing countries. And if you start to track, this is just Africa showing the 1960 population at 282 million, and if you track over the next few years, this is that's 2000, we're now going to 2020 and 2040, you see these dramatic changes in colors of the increased population growth and density in certain of the areas, and just look at Nigeria there and the population it has. So more of these threats and pressures. Of course, around the world, a great increase in large-scale monogastric production, and by that I mean pigs and poultry. Many of the poor keep poultry, but also predominantly small ruminants and cattle, and so that is a competition. The demand for higher food quality and safety, which is a tremendous demand in terms of whether they can meet those standards. Zoonotic diseases, which I'll say a bit about in a minute, are very prevalent employment in poor livestock keeping populations. And other globalization issues, the increased trade and movement, of course, encourages spread of animal diseases, food safety concerns, and the conservation of animal genetic resources. And issues such as economies of scale, where small producers without groupings and marketing operations very difficult. And to add one more, climate change. Having talked about the marketing side and the importance in opportunities, it's important to stress that there are other very important livelihood roles for livestock to the poor. They are central to the livelihoods of about 600 million rural poor in the world. And they contribute to many ways that many of you in California may not appreciate. Manure for soil fertility. People don't go running out and buying bags of fertilizer. Traction for land preparation, very common in Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia. Harvesting, transporting products, meat, milk and eggs for consumption, for sale. And this sale brings cash for education and healthcare, where there is no other source of income. Hides and skins, which are used in the house, but also for sale. Wage employment, self-employment, and very importantly, this social networking, social security, the cattle being the walking bank account. Now, some very interesting work has been done recently on trying to tease out the livelihood assets, not just for livestock, but for all sorts of different commodities, and fitting into 5 forms of capital. And this is just illustrating how diseases can threaten these. Financial capital, so morbidity and mortality, reducing the income flows, and also the investment value of livestock. The human capital, zoonotic diseases affecting people, foodborne diseases, depriving the poor household of the primary income earner, the person, if they are not well. And of course, productivity decreases, reducing the consumption and income generation that might be destined for education or medical expenses. And then we have social capital, natural capital, and physical capital. Social capital, loss of these relationships, and in times of crisis, very important, the loss of manure. And the physical capital, these farm tools, the traction and the use of animals for movement. The animal diseases are of much greater importance to the poor because most of the poor live in tropical countries. And in tropical countries, there's just more disease. In the tropics, unrestricted movement. The production systems generally are more susceptible to disease. Less disease control with less resources. And of course, less capacity to bear risk because being closer to the threshold. And this image gives you some of those
2 well-known pieces of evidence
of uses, the ploughing there in the northern part of Kenya, the role of donkeys in garbage collection in the suburbs of Cairo, the pigs and poultry in Southeast Asia, and the cattle in the Sahel. Now, these are vastly different roles of livestock to the ones that most of you, not all of you, are used to. The developed world contrasts dramatically. But the sad thing is that the developed world is the main source of funding for the research into the sorts of problems that I have just illustrated. But the developed world has a different understanding of the role of livestock. It's fundamentally the protein in people's diets, the milk and the meat. And there are other things, of course. But as affluence and dietary alternatives and options have come, and the great marketing and availability of products that you have here has led to this reduction in consumption of animal protein, partly for health. People don't want to eat too much red meat, and many alternatives. And of course the media, which are so effective, as they're not so much in the developed world, disseminating these messages of beware of this, that and the other. The rise of animal welfare concerns and people being concerned about the role of animals and consuming animal products. The negative environmental impacts of intensive production. And so, as you can see, there's a completely different perspective. And that is one of our great problems and concerns in putting this message over about the needs in the developing world. So, what is the optimal pathway or combination of pathways out of poverty? Well, countries adopt national development programs, and poverty reduction slowly coming in there because it is slowly emerging as one of the central focuses of national development programs, but still not by no means universal. And traditionally, the way to attack that is economic growth, promoting economic growth and the thicker arrows. But more recently, much more emphasis being put on by various donors and sponsors of development to the promotion of equity. What is the key? What is the answer? Which one should it be? Clearly, it's not a simple either or, but to be a bit provocative, is it focus on the everyday constraints of those livelihoods and assets of the very poor, which, of course, positive in terms of the direct impact you're going to have on the poor, but the difficulty is that that's a job for life, not only for life, a job for generations. And for every person moving out of poverty, there's another one, at least another one entering. Or is it a focus on national and institutional economic growth, promotes this environment for development and encourages the entrepreneurs in society to participate and get in, but of course relies on the trickle-down effect to the really poor? How could you translate those ideas into animal diseases and what to tackle? This is what we've been thinking about a little bit. If it's the livelihoods focus, the first one that I mentioned, it's really the health, feeds, breeding and management constraints that are there every day the poor livestock keeper wakes up. And the impacts, trying to get impacts on those things take an awful long time, and they'll be very small. If it's the economic growth focus, maybe the constraints that prohibit or limit trade, and the impact on them has been shown in some regions of the world to be quite large, although not necessarily sustainable, and relatively short term in achieving them. And particularly in South America, the success stories of foot-and-mouth disease in Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, but in Argentina's economy didn't necessarily follow the pathway that my theory is suggesting. And Southern Africa, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Southern Africa. And I'm going to build now on two contrasting studies that we have been doing and give you a little bit of an illustration of different approaches. One is trying to determine the priorities for investment in animal health, and the second is taking particularly one of those diseases of trade and its control and seeing how well what impact it has on poverty. And for those of you who are interested, both of these can be downloaded or seen on our website www.ilri.org. The first one is this investing in animal health research to alleviate poverty. And the start of this process is really, we focused, because of the limited time constraints for it, Sub-Saharan Africa, minus some countries without data, South Asia and Southeast Asia was the focus of this study. And the ingredients were, first of all, where are the poor associated with livestock? Which are the species that are most important to their livelihoods? Which diseases have the greatest impact on those species? What are the health needs and research opportunities? And finally, how do you balance their priorities with where the research opportunities are and the capacity to do research? How can we pull that together? We started by taking a livestock production system classification for the world that was developed by Serret and Steinfeld in 1996, which divides basically into three, taking this side to be simplistic. The pastoral, meaning those who have in more arid areas, keeping livestock and moving around a lot. the agro-pastoral, which is the mixed farming systems in which livestock are mixed in with other agricultural enterprises, and the growing and very important peri-urban areas which have lots of livestock. And so the first step was to have a distribution of the poor, and this was taking national poverty data available throughout the world and superimposing it on that production system's data surface, coming up with this distribution. And within that we were able to then say what is the breakdown of different systems in different regions of the world, and these are these four main regions that we were looking at, and quite a contrast. The bottom, a few key things that came out of it. The majority of the poor associated with livestock found in these mixed crop livestock systems, over 90%. And pastoralists, one always has got the image of pastoralists and livestock being very important, but really accounting for only 5%. The majority of the poor living in South Asia, that's just because of the huge population, 57%. And then a larger, if one adjusts the way of looking at poverty, a larger share lives in sub-Saharan Africa. But one of the key things that's the cross-sectional photographic image of what's going on today. But if you look at the change in poverty rates, this is the 1987 to 98 World Bank data, poverty rates growing in South Asia, growing substantially, something like 3% in sub-Saharan Africa, and dropping in the rest of the world. So clearly, although the majority of people are in South Asia, it's sub-Saharan Africa where it's growing so fast. A few key things that came out of the predictions that the agro-pastoral systems will expand purely because of human population growth, but because of the contrasting influence of climate change, in some areas pastoralism will replace agro-pastoralism in some sorts of sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at this map, this is the distribution of the systems, and as I go from 2000 to 2050, you can see a changes in the distribution of some of those systems. On the livestock species, the poor usually keep more than one species. This came out of this study. Each species has multiple roles in the household, and there is this thing that we've called the livestock ladder in many settings. So people starting with poultry and small ruminants, and then graduating into a cow, and maybe not more, and various permutations and combinations of that goes around. If you break it down by the systems, pastoral systems, sheep, goats are predominant. The agro-pastoral, it's cattle, and the peri-urban, landless, poultry and sheep. And if you look into the regions, pigs and poultry, very important in Southeast Asia, cattle and buffalo in South Asia, and then sheep and goats and poultry in West Africa. So that was where are the poor and what are the species. The next we had was identifying diseases and trying to rank them, and this was done through various ways of literature, but also with some workshops in different parts of the world. And we tried to quantify this. We developed, and it's inevitably slightly controversial, a ranking of diseases. And so we have estimates which came from literature and expert opinion of expected incidences, and then taking the severity of that incidence to get some sort of a score. And then the next is costs of treatment and prevention. So you've got the effects of the disease and then the cost of the prevention. And then we weighted these different elements. So the production losses we weighted by 70%, and the control costs by 15%, and we also had an element for national costs. So if there is public sector money going in at the national level to promote marketing effects or public expenditures on vaccines, they were put in there. So we developed this scoring system. The results, and these are all in these documents that you can get hold of, are the 20 highest ranked 3 syndromes 4 very general disease categories and 13 specific diseases. And I don't really want to go into the great details of that because that's not my point, but just to mention that the 3 syndromes of neonatal mortality, reproductive disorders of various sorts, and the micronutritional deficiencies are virtually identical to the 3 major syndrome issues that the WHO came up with 2 years before in their study of human health conditions in the developing world. So we have a lot in common there. The 13 specific diseases were many that you will be familiar with and some possibly less familiar with. But as I say, I don't want to go into too much detail because you can see it. This is when we aggregated them at a global level, and the colors represent the different regional contributions, but of course we teased them out to individual regions. And of course some represented diseases that affect multiple species, and our ranking meant that they scored higher, those that scored that have got, let's say, 6 species, as in helminthiasis. But there are some with only 1 species, such as Newcastle disease, that ranks extremely high. The zoonotic diseases extremely important to the poor, the grouping of the foodborne, infectious and vector-borne. And some key points that came out of that component: the poor are particularly at risk through the environments in which they live. And examples of cysticercosis, in which consuming with the lack of latrines and animals everywhere, leptospirosis with rats and so on, and rabies with urban populations. The lower down the poverty scale you are, the more you're likely to be at risk of multiple zoonoses. And of course, animals are very important because for many of these, prevention of those diseases in humans is through animals, through the sleeping sickness, rabies, brucella, and the neurocysticercosis caused by cysticercus in pigs. We then tried to pull all these things together, and we picked up some research opportunities coming in from the field, and these were some that came in, people saying that vaccines, the major problem is the cold chain, because if you're stuck in the middle of nowhere, the cold chain without facilities. Access to biological products, because in many countries only vets are allowed to handle and deliver biological products. Doesn't mean to say that they're the only people that do, but there is legislation, and really the vets often have no access to these poor regions. And other constraints in diagnostics, in epidemiology, and in the technology transfer. Very limited delivery systems and research often not filtering down. In issues relating to delivery of animal health services, these 4 came out as very important. Accessibility of services, the acceptability, in other words, services in a form appropriate for the poor. Affordability is critical, and the sustainability, so not just a short-term non-governmental organization that goes in. How can these things be sustainably available? We consulted a whole range of researchers in different organizations, and we got them to get together over the email, and we convened a group of them, 2 groups in fact, and we got them to identify for many different known disease circumstances what are the main research opportunities, putting them in these categories of vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, epidemiology, and this delivery and adoption. And we got them to identify what types of research are major opportunities at the moment, timeframes, costs, probabilities of success, and also where the capacity was. And so this was assembled, and all this information is available. We felt that it was important to categorize research opportunities into 3 groupings. The first of all, the grouping of the use of knowledge, the innovation process, how to use knowledge and available tools to attack these classic performance inhibitors, some of the ones that came up on those general syndromes. But secondly, a next level up, if you like, or down, depending on your perspective, is research in adapting existing technologies, making them more effective and appropriate. And thirdly, of course, the making sure that there are opportunities to capitalize on the developments of science and the next frontier of technology development, new technologies. So we started to think about these research opportunities, identified those people in these groupings. We also went back to those diseases and we classified the diseases in a set of groupings. And these are convenience, as you'll see. It's a convenience classification to get a framework for viewing animal health research opportunities. The first one was diseases that exacerbate the insecurities and the fundamental assets of the livelihoods of the poor, that threaten and degrade the asset base, and those ones that really are there every day. The second was the grouping that limit market opportunities, restricting the poor from exploiting market opportunities. And the third, those that limit livestock-based intensification of systems, and by intensification I mean increased inputs for greater productivity efficiency, greater productivity and productivity efficiency. And as you can see, if you put these groupings so you've got the securing assets, the enhancing market opportunities, and the intensification, different categories of diseases sit in these different three groupings. Now, they're not mutually exclusive, but there are some that fit nicely in one, and there are some that overlap, and some that fit quite squarely in at least two. So here you've got obviously the endemic diseases, the foodborne and zoonoses and transboundary, and here those that prohibit intensification. And examples of those would be those diseases that are a problem when you upgrade into a more productive genotype and then you increase the susceptibility to certain diseases. And what we did is we created this little matrix. So you might say we were trying to please everybody in terms of potential researchers and potential donors. So if you're into the more frontline transferring, there is something for you in all of those three types of disease. Or if you're into this, or if your business is into those three, there's something for everybody. And this is the end result, in which we have listed a synthesis of those things that came out as high priority and when there were research opportunities. But I add a caveat that this is meant to be a way of looking at things, and so other people might have other things that they would like to put in these categories. But there are some that come out very obviously. For example, in this one, which is reducing the constraints to intensification. Now, an example in Highland, East Africa, is the use of Holstein cattle in zero grazing stall-fed systems, and you put them into a stall, and you cut and carry and bring the fodder. Heat detection is a serious constraint to that system working. But we're not looking at new technologies, but we're looking at how we can get that system working in there. And so that is, all of these are different categories that fit in there. It's important to just, as I conclude this part of the talk, that there is a group of donors and commercial pharmaceutical industries that are trying to form a consortium to pick up what we call the low-hanging apples in this group, of where they're particularly in this group of improving tools or new tools, where there are technologies that the pharmaceutical industry may have, but they have never wanted to develop because there's no money in it, and the public sector donors coming in and saying, okay, well, we will investigate supporting to get these going. Back to my picture of the economic growth and which way do you go? Livestock trade, but international trade, offers an important opportunity. And as I said, there are predicted increases in this demand for meat and milk in the developing countries, and huge potential for countries to meet this demand and then use that as this pathway out of poverty. And there is no doubt there are, as you all know from Californian experience in a variety of agricultural products, positive effect of exports on domestic prices as well. But for developing countries, increasing a need to meet these stringent sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And this can be either keeping them out of the market or these very high transaction costs of allowing them in. Also, this need, I say this with a smile because it's something that might be close to your hearts, the need to overcome the imbalances in agricultural subsidies. And I know there are a few rows going on in the world on some of these issues at the moment. But what we feel is important to think of research that promotes keeping smallholders in business. The second study that we've recently done is this impact and poverty reduction implications of foot and mouth disease control in southern Africa. Now, southern Africa, first of all, foot and mouth disease, this is foot and mouth disease in the UK, and this is foot and mouth disease in Kenya. So in many developing countries, foot and mouth disease is of no consequence to low-producing smallholder systems. In southern Africa, it is important because, as I will say, they have managed to get rid of it in large parts of their countries and are able to export. The components of the study were looking at the risk in southern Africa, but also we went completely to the other end and started looking at poverty, and particularly the role of livestock to the poor, the role of disease control to them, and the role of foot and mouth disease control, direct implications on the poor. So the other end of the spectrum. We looked at trends in international beef trade and then did a benefit cost analysis of foot and mouth disease controls in Zimbabwe as a case study country, and we tried to pull it together and make some conclusions, which I will talk about in a moment. Southern Africa is quite unique. North of here, and even here in Mozambique, foot and mouth disease is pretty well endemic. But southern Africa, for a variety of reasons, has had its act together. And what they do is, the major worry is the buffalo populations that are in these parks, the Kruger National Park, Gonarezo, Hwangi, and Matusadona, and round here in northern Botswana. And so there are various fences and surveillance systems to keep it out, and the potential to export. Little bit of a problem in Zimbabwe at the moment, and so these are these different zones, and this is these potential export zones. Interestingly, the southern Africa, we've also been looking at foot and mouth disease and implications in Southeast Asia, but there they haven't yet got access to export. In southern Africa, they've had this export to beef to the EU for something like 10 or 12 years, depending on the country, and it's extremely important to them. And some of these countries have got specific advantages of exporting to the EU. And so these are the key countries of Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. This is the country where I live in Kenya. And they have a system where they're allowed to export certain quotas at vastly reduced tariffs, and these are under the Cotonou Protocol, which is a follow-up of the Lomé Convention. So these, Botswana, the biggest, sort of almost 20,000 tons at what ends up being almost twice the global price in beef. We looked at, and this is of interest, of certain changes on the international beef trade, which will, of course, affect the United States, that is very active in this. First of all, as far as they're concerned, exports to Europe, there is in Europe the Common Agricultural Policy, which is something that has had very high subsidies in European agriculture, as there might be some in the United States, I'm not sure. And there is a lot of pressure to reduce those. There are also reforms to the World Trade Organization, and of course for these countries with this special agreement there are negotiations on how that might continue, because it lapses in 2007. And the reforms into the CAP, of course, aren't all necessarily going smoothly, and some countries, one represented on the left wanting to move faster, and some wanting to move slower. But the overall implications of those different changes, meaning that there are likely to be certain tariff advantages to these southern African countries continuing. So there will be an increased demand for products and an incentive for export. But beef prices will likely drop. And the other important thing is that competition from other countries who, as the WTO revises, are likely to also get access to special tariff markets in Europe. And particularly the competitive markets are Argentina and Brazil. Competitiveness will become very important. So we looked at, is foot-and-mouth disease control worthwhile in southern Africa? Who pays and who benefits? And what happens to the poor? We did this in various ways, the benefit-cost analysis, but also we looked at, occasionally there are bans on beef exports, and we tried to look at what are the effects of those bans in terms of who does it affect. There are multiplier effects that come in, and price effects when they're banned. And multiplier effects, I'm not an economist, but I work with an economist, and I see Tim Carpenter in the back there, so this is for Tim Carpenter teaching my proverbial granny to suck eggs, but for others it might be of interest. And the multiplier effects of the beef sector composed of production, marketing and processing going into export, but of course these are fed by many other sectors in the national economy. When there is a ban from foot-and-mouth disease occurring that stops those exports, first of all it affects the processing sectors and these revenue losses within the sector, but of course very importantly it affects the other sectors. So the beer industry that was relying on the chaps from the slaughterhouse to buy their beer, who are then sent home for 3 months, also suffers. The other thing is, does it affect prices? And without going into great detail on this, the answer was yes. So access to export markets increases local prices, and bans on export have effects that ripple down throughout the economy, not just on those that are directly affected. The results of our cost-benefit analysis, interestingly, showed that we had various scenarios that I haven't told you, but we had a pessimistic scenario in which the country, Zimbabwe in this case, disinvests in foot-and-mouth disease control. And we show that for every dollar disinvested, 5 further dollars lost by the country compared to our baseline scenario. So dramatic negative effects of disinvestment, and that doesn't include the regional impacts. That was just for Zimbabwe, but as I inferred, other countries in the region are suffering because of Zimbabwe's current situation, and the disease has spilled over into other countries. In our optimistic scenarios, what if they really invested and really pulled back the frontiers of their free zones? There would be for every dollar invested, a 1.5 return. And that doesn't sound small, but these numbers are fairly robust, and it's very positive. Also, significant multiplier trade bans, 1.8, meaning that there is for every $1 lost, there's another $0.8 lost going into the other support services. And higher beef prices transmitted, as I said, to the domestic markets. Now, when you look at who pays and who benefits, strangely enough, and this is a residue of systems gone by, the costs of all these services are largely borne by the public sector. But although a few benefits return to the public sector, such as the infrastructures allowing to control other diseases, and also the foreign exchange that is brought in by beef, most of the profits go to the commercial beef sector, and they don't pay. But 16% though of the increased economic activity does get transferred to the lower income households, and we weren't able to distinguish adequately the impacts on the poorer sectors in this particular study. Now, that shows a very positive picture. We also did this livelihoods analysis. So this was PRAs in different parts. Who are the poor? What are their different roles of livestock? How do they get involved in marketing? What is their contact and interest in veterinary services? And what really does foot and mouth disease control mean to them? And we developed this classification and groupings of the poor with livestock. And this is a big table, but I really only want you to look at one point, which is down there. And these groupings are, so we have got here small stock accumulators with no cattle access, and small stock accumulators with a few cattle, and small stock that do own cattle for draft, and then some that that are in cropping and limited trade, some that do sell, and this is the group that regularly markets. So the bottom line is that of the livestock keepers, 1% regularly poor livestock keepers, 1% regularly marketing cattle that might go into this export market, and the majority of them being what we call wealth storers. So they are storers of cattle, so that they've got or goats and sheep, so they've got animals there that can trade, can be sold at a moment for school fees or for education. So now the questions with balancing those things: is foot and mouth disease pro-poor in this case study? Well, on the one hand, foot and mouth disease gives access to these export markets, which produces positive economic growth, and that is pro-poor. And we've seen that the export bans have these wide-ranging multiple effects on different societies, so yes, it's pro-poor. But the other side is, of course, that only less than 2% of these poor livestock keepers actually participate in marketing of cattle destined for that export. So really, foot and mouth disease isn't very pro-poor. And the poor are actually engaged in using livestock for wealth storing. And so if you start to go in and say, no, well, I want we want to persuade you to market those animals, marketing might be non-pro-poor, if that's the right word, because it's taking animals out of their main livelihood strategy. Difficult. So is it pro-poor? The bottom line is there is no simple answer. I'll say that first of all to defend myself. And it does support economic growth, not strong on directly promoting equity. But from an economist's point of view, you would then say, well, what are the alternative investments that would be more pro-poor? And in Zimbabwe, take the example, what about going into goat and poultry health? Because those are the animals really important to them. And the question is, well, who would invest? And would it be investments to the same amount of money? And would it continue to promote that sort of infrastructure development that foot and mouth disease control provides? And of course, the answers to those questions are probably no. What have we learnt from this? Well, first, international trade and its size matters. Effective national control allows meat exports that do allow these national positive benefits. And this picture shows that this is the justification for foot and mouth disease control here, and this is down to different countries and different systems, going from subsistence oriented to highly commercial. And this is the threshold of getting into export markets. So there are many African and Asian countries that can't get enough control to reach that threshold or to get into export. So they've only minimal control of foot and mouth disease is justified. The minute you cross this threshold, as countries like the Philippines and Thailand are trying to do, Zimbabwe has done, the percent justified by the trade gains are huge because the returns are huge. And then when you get up into the US, it's mostly justified by the production losses that would occur and the other indirect occurrence. So it's a very interesting, complex picture in the world. The key is the major beneficiary of exports is the large-scale commercial enterprises, but they don't really pay. And so rational economic thought would suggest that private sector stakeholders should be much more engaged in picking this cost up. But mechanisms to do this we need. Also, foot-and-mouth disease control is increasingly important to regions. So if any one country disinvests, other countries will be affected. And so can we take this concept of rational thought and say one country investing in the neighboring country? Well, of course, the United States has been doing it for a long time, investing in surveillance in Central and Northern South America. But that same concept might have to be thought of from the United States perspective to a little bit further afield, given the increased mobility in the world, and the concept also brought into other regions. And so I bring the suggestion of broader groupings, and then this, how do you put that into action? So, but generally, the public sector is putting much more emphasis on poverty reduction. So the involvement, and as FMD control tends to not have great effects, direct effects on poverty reduction, it's going to be important that the public investment is partnered with private investment to do this, which is what I'm saying in those. Livestock are a very critical resource to the poor in the world. And as I hope I've demonstrated, improvements in animal health offer substantial opportunities for poverty reduction. Research issues facing this center on a better understanding of the mechanisms by which mechanisms and pathways, I should say, by which policies, strategies and technologies can secure the assets of the poor, promote intensification and enhance the market opportunities for their development. And I would like to end by saying I believe that epidemiology has a very strong role, as I hope I've illustrated, to play in this process. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Brian, for a very enlightening seminar. I think you've clearly demonstrated a very important role for animal health and clearly the role that epidemiology can play. We'd be willing to field a couple questions if there are. Mike?
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment. I think, I find it incredibly disappointing for a country like Africa that we still see livestock as the future for Africa in terms of poverty reduction. There wasn't one mention of the natural resources of Africa, which includes wildlife. And indeed in Zimbabwe has one of the most progressive community-based natural resource management programs. Most of the poor in Africa live in marginal lands, less than 600 millimeter rainfall, where cattle raising is not always the best option. And I think that we've got to think outside the box. Livestock is important, it's culturally important, it's important as a protein source. But there's also another resource there, which is wildlife, gold products, and a variety of other things that need to be considered.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, and a good rap over the knuckles. We do have a major component of our research looking at the role of wildlife and natural resource management. We have a whole research theme on natural resource management, and so I acknowledge that. I spoke a little bit more about wildlife yesterday than I did today, but your point. But I will say, however, having bowed and scraped, that it does vary regionally, and you in southern Africa are particularly lucky in that you have been particularly successful in managing that wildlife resource, and that is not by no means the same in all parts of the continent, and but yeah, good point.
Yes, Yoma?
Yes, I'd just like to make a few comments. The first thing is there is a current discussion going on today at USAID in many institutions because there is a feeling that fighting poverty become a multi-billion-dollar industry by itself. Is sustains the UN organizations, many international organizations. And what Gustav Staels, the former UNDP Director General, is that any assistance that does not lead to self-sufficiency actually sustains poverty. That is really the real situation. All our attempts to transfer technology to Africa at this point is really fought because within the UN organization there are those who selling kids. We cannot do this. So we are now discussing major issues. How do we prevent this international organization from preventing technology transfer to Africa?
Thank you, Dr. Yilma, for a characteristically provocative point. The UN organizations, gosh, I think that increasingly the UN, multitude of UN organizations play a very marginal role in so many aspects of delivery of technologies. I think that it's a long time since they were central in anything relating to delivery of technologies. I think the most successful programs in delivering of technologies are those that are community-based, that those are if there is external support that is trying to promote the sustainability, it's on the basis of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who are trying to develop community animal health workers and indigenous local capacity. So I think it's a long way away from these massive FAO and campaigns of the past, I believe. But I will agree with one thing that you said, and that is that the world, and I think whether it is the UN organizations, whether it is countries or different entities or individuals, have failed in the livestock sector to really have an impact in Africa, whether it is animal health technologies or feed technologies or whatever. They have generally not been very successful, and so I certainly acknowledge that one.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we'll bring this to a close. I want to thank all of you for coming, and again, let's give a hand to Secretary.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.